I'm Walter Woon. I used to be an NMP, Attorney General, also at one time an ambassador. I'm now visiting professor at SMU. I was one of those who supported the creation of an elected presidency. And when the select committee met to consider the amendments to the Constitution, I was invited to give evidence. The point that I made was that the president represents all of us, not just one political party. And I'd suggested that he should be politically neutral. And I wasn't the only one. There are other people who made that same point. And that found its way into the Constitution. That's why the president has to resign from his political party. He breaks his kettles, he sinks his boats, he resigns from his ministerial posts, and that's what Mr. Ong Teng Cheong did. Now, the problem is that the first past the post system that we've got only really works when you've got two candidates. Because when you've got two candidates, the winner will have 50% at the very least. If you have three candidates, it is quite possible that the winner won't have the majority. And that's happened in so many countries. England, for example, from which we borrow our electoral system. And we saw it happen in the 2011 election. The 4 Tans election. And for the record, I voted for Tony Tan. So this is not sour grapes and sore loser. Okay, I voted for him, but he only got just over a third. To me, that's not really good for the presidency. The president should have a clear mandate. Well, the president is the head of state, and before we became independent, Queen Elizabeth II was our head of state, and then when we achieved self-government, we had a Yang di-Pertuan Negara, Inche Yusof bin Ishak, and after that we became part of Malaysia, and the Malaysian Yang di-Pertuan Agong became our head of state, and when we divorced from Malaysia, we had a president as a head of state. The head of state was purely a figurehead, just like the Queen, just like King Charles III in England, purely a figurehead and therefore appointed by Parliament. So unlike in hereditary monarchy, as in the UK, we have an appointed, or had an appointed head of state. The government, to its credit, decided that it would be better for the political development of Singapore, there had to be independent voices. So first we had the non-constituency MPs, the nominated MPs, and finally the elected president. The elected president is not executive. He's not like the American president or the French president. He doesn't run the country. He's still the head of state, just like King Charles, except he's got more power. The powers are twofold. The ostensible reason for having the president was the fear that a populist government would raid the piggy bank. They'd go out, they'd take the money that had been saved so laboriously over the decades, and they would spend it merrily in order to buy support. That's one danger. So far, we've not had that kind of situation. The government has been very fiscally prudent, which is why during COVID, they could dole out all these supports, which very few countries in the world could really afford without going deep into debt. And the debt is inherited by future generations. So that's the first thing, fiscal conservatism, making sure that the reserves weren't raided. But there is a more important day-to-day aspect of the president's powers, and that is to make sure that the public service remains clean. Because we've seen too many other countries where key positions are given to supporters or friends, family, nepotism creeps in, abuse of power creeps in. So the president in Singapore has got these veto powers to refuse to appoint certain key people. The accountant general, the auditor general, the attorney general, who's public prosecutor, very important. The chief justice, the chiefs of the defense force, the army, the navy, and the new cyber force, the commissioner of police, the director of CPIB, all key positions. Because you can imagine what would happen if you had people who were intent on subverting the public service. They would put in their friends, their relatives, their supporters, partly as rewards, but also to show up their own position. So the president is our bulwark against this kind of thing. Now, I did say the president doesn't have executive powers, but he has influence. So if you take something like, for example, death penalty, as a matter of course, a petition for clemency to the president in death penalty cases. The president doesn't decide, the cabinet decides. But the president has got influence. So when I was Attorney General, President Nathan would ask me to come in if he had any questions, and we would talk so that he could be satisfied that the petition should be granted or not granted, as the case may be. So I was privileged to work with President Ong, who, despite the fact that I didn't vote for him, appointed me as his legal advisor. And he jolly well knew I didn't vote for him because I told him, didn't vote for you, but yeah, that didn't stop him. And President Nathan, who unfortunately was not elected, but still took his job seriously. Let us say, hypothetically, the Prime Minister of the day is raiding the sovereign wealth fund, taking out billions, financing films in America and heaven knows what else. And the Attorney General gets a report from the Director of the CPIB that this is happening. The Attorney General gets removed, the Director gets removed, and the new people who are going to be put in are clearly there to put a stop to any prosecutions. The President can say, no, I don't agree with these new appointments. The only reason you're putting in this particular person is not because he's the best qualified, it's because he's going to say, well, there's no evidence. And the reason why you've taken away the Director of the CPIB is because he wants to probe. So I'm not appointing these guys. What would happen in that case is that there would be a political impasse. Because the Prime Minister will say, I insist, and the President will say, well, no, I refuse. This is why it's so important that the President has a strong mandate from the people. Because the Prime Minister's response to that is, well, you know, the people elected me, so who are you to stop this? The President will counter by saying, people elected me too, and I'm here to make sure the system works. This kind of scenario hasn't happened yet in Singapore. But to think that we will be forever immune, I think, would be naive. For your generation, this will be a problem if we don't strengthen the institution now. If we let it die, when the time comes, there will be no check. Yes, well, I would say so. Like I said, so far the government has been very fiscally prudent, and I expect that that will continue under the present government and the future government. So his primary role is to make sure the system remains clean. I'm not saying that it will not become clean, but I'm saying that human experience has shown that we cannot be naive and complacent about this, and it's always better to have someone who is outside the political structure looking in, and that in itself is a deterrent and a check on abuse of power. When you know that there's somebody up there who can put a stop to it, that helps to keep the system clean. One has to be very careful. Transparency is one of these things we bandy about saying it's a good thing. You cannot resolve differences if everyone insists on doing it in public. This is the problem. I mean, just think of a family dispute. You've got a family dispute, you don't want to be yelling at each other across the street from HDB block to HDB block. I mean, you basically want to get together quietly somewhere and work it out. And for most of the time, it does work that way. But there may be situations where the Prime Minister is adamant and the President says, no, you're not being honest. In this age of social media, of new media and all that, the President has got tools which did not exist in Mr. Ong Teng Cheong's time. So he can say, look here, let's see, right? We're putting this out in the public. This is why I'm disagreeing with you. I'm not going to do this secretly. I make my reasons known. One has to be very, very careful about doing this, right? We've seen too much of this in the West, where basically they think that diplomacy can be conducted by yelling at each other across oceans. It just makes things worse. But there comes a time and a point where that kind of publicity, or at least the threat of that kind of publicity, can lead to a compromise. The important thing is that the President should not be political. The Prime Minister should not think that the President's out to get him or undermine him. That is the key. Once you've got a President in opposition to the Prime Minister, you have a recipe for real political drama. I hope that when people vote, they do it knowing what the President's job is. In the case of Mr. Ong, I was skeptical that he would be independent, and I think that Mr. Ong felt that he had to prove he was independent. So that's why I voted for Mr. Chua Kim Yeow. In the case of the Four Tan's election, and I looked at the other three. Well, I've known Jisei for a long time. We were in school together, so but when I looked at the other three, I asked myself, if something goes wrong, who is most likely to be able to put a check on that. Who is most able to, right? And of the three, I thought Dr. Tony Tan would be the person who had the stature to do it, because he was retired from politics already. So that was the reason for my choice. I would say above all, he shouldn't want the job that much. Seriously, a person who wants the job, sometimes wants it too much. Drawing an analogy to independent directors of listed companies, the best independent director is someone who doesn't need the job, doesn't want the job, but he's doing there because somebody has to do the job. So I would say that's the ideal candidate. He doesn't really need the job, he's not really sure he wants the job, but he's there because it's got to be done. Somebody's got to do it. And you can't just say, well, I support this in theory, but when time comes, I slink away quietly. Well, I hope they will keep in mind that whoever we elect as president is going to represent all of us and not just one political party, that they will choose someone who can fulfill that job and not just vote because they don't like so-and-so. Think carefully about it. It's 6 years, and the world is not a happy place at the moment. We need a good person at the helm.